December 3rd, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest. The name itself would become a synonym for misery, a 50-square-mile patch of impenetrable darkness on the German border that the Allies had to take. It is cold, not just cold, but a deep, penetrating bone cold that settles in the joints and refuses to leave. It is the kind of cold that turns metal brittle and men's hopes even more so. The trees, ancient and dense, are bare, their black silhouettes clawing at a sky the color of dirty ash. Fog hangs low, clinging to the shattered earth like a ghost, a shroud that muffles sound and sight. Visibility is measured in feet, not yards. Somewhere in that fog, artillery thumps with a steady, metronomic rhythm. It is the giant heartbeat of the front, a sound so constant it has become part of the air itself, like the smell of pine, cordite, and death. This is not open warfare. This is not the dash across France. This is a meat grinder. Inside an M4 Sherman tank, designation C-113, parked behind the shattered ruins of a brick wall, a young gunner named Harlon Vickery leans into the eyepiece of his 75mm cannon. His breath fogs the glass. His fingers, numb inside their gloves, tighten around the firing mechanism. He is quiet, still, listening. There is something wrong with this picture. The tank's hull is facing away from the presumed enemy. Its cannon, encased in the heavy steel turret, is not facing forward. It is turned a full 180 degrees, pointing backward, staring grimly over the engine deck. His loader, Private First Class Mike Rizzo, looks at him sideways. The cramped, oil-scented air of the turret thick with unspoken tension. He mutters, "You're really doing this backwards setup thing, huh?" Harlon doesn't answer. He just listens. He is waiting for a sound beneath the artillery, a sound he knows better than his own name, the crunch of treads, the specific, deep-throated growl of a German engine. Then, through the mist, a shape emerges. It is a Panther tank, German, heavy, lethal. Its long 75mm gun, a high-velocity killer, slices through the fog like a shark's fin. It is flanked by two more, rolling slowly down a muddy, canalized path as if they own the forest. They are confident, arrogant, and safe in the knowledge that any American tank they meet will be outgunned and outmatched. Harlon exhales, a plume of white in the frigid air. One shot. The 75mm round from his M4 cannon punches through the morning stillness. The report is sharp, violent. A second later, the lead Panther erupts in a blinding flash of flying metal and fire. The shell, perfectly placed, struck the thinner side armor. A deafening clang, followed by an eruption of flame. The Panther's heavy turret, weighing tons, is blown clean upward, staggering in the air before crashing down. Black smoke boils skyward. The other two German tanks hesitate. They stop, their turrets slewing left and right, searching, confused. They were not expecting a shot from behind a collapsed farmhouse. They were not expecting a Sherman to be waiting for them. And they sure as hell weren't expecting a Sherman to be sniping, accurately, at long range. Inside the turret of C-113, the loader gasps. The commander, Staff Sergeant Gene Corbin, shouts into the intercom, "Holy hell, Vickery, you hit him! You hit him clean!" But Harlon Vickery doesn't celebrate. He is already adjusting the turret, his movements economical and precise, tracking the second tank. Because this isn't luck. This is mathematics. This is a strategy. This is what happens when a quiet farm boy from Kentucky, a boy who grew up fixing tractors, rewrites the rules of armored warfare by turning his Sherman tank backwards and turning himself into a one-man sniper team. They had laughed at him. They had called it hillbilly logic. They said it would never work, that it was suicidal. They said it until it did. And when the smoke finally cleared over the frozen mud of the Hürtgen, the Germans weren't the only ones who were surprised. Before he became the man who stunned a German tank column in the heart of the Hürtgen Forest, Harlon Vickery was just another quiet kid from Whitley County, Kentucky. He wasn't tall, he wasn't loud, he didn't grow up surrounded by military history or the mechanics of war. He didn't grow up around tanks or even many cars. He grew up with his hands covered in grease, fixing tractors on his father's small farm. His father ran the farm. His mother was a schoolteacher. He understood machinery not as a weapon, but as a tool. He understood angles not from trigonometry class, but from plowing a field. Like so many other young men of his generation, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 provided a moment of terrible clarity. Harlon enlisted in the United States Army. He felt it was, quite simply, the right thing to do. He never imagined he would end up inside a 30-ton steel box. He certainly never imagined he would be commanding its gun in one of the deadliest forests in modern European history. His training took him to Fort Knox, Kentucky, the heart of the U.S. Army's Armored Division. It was here that his instructors first noted his peculiarities. He had steady hands, a byproduct of years spent calibrating engines. He had sharp eyes. But most importantly, he had a quiet, methodical way of thinking through problems that most recruits, eager and loud, simply didn't possess. While other gunners fired by instinct, by feel, Harlon did math in his head. He measured the distance. He watched the wind. He calculated the shell drop. He was not a natural. He was a mechanic. Still, in the massive, churning bureaucracy of a wartime army, no one particularly noticed him. He wasn't the fastest loader. He wasn't the loudest talker. And in a war where big, aggressive personalities often rose to the top, Harlon Vickery stayed in the shadows. He was just another component in the machine, loaded onto a transport and shipped to Europe. By the time his unit landed in France in August 1944, the war had shifted. The desperate gamble of D-Day had paid off. The Americans had broken out of the hedgerows of Normandy. The Allies were pushing east, a massive armored tide driving the Germans back toward their own border. But now came the hard part. The dash across the open fields of France was over. Now they were entering the terrain that would define the rest of the war. Ground that heavily favored the defender. Hills, dense forests, narrow roads, and deep mud. This was ambush country. This was the Stolberg Corridor, the gateway to the Hürtgen. When Harlon's division, part of the 3rd Armored, pushed into this sector in September, they were part of a reconnaissance in force. Combat Command B, nicknamed TF Lovelady, ran headlong into the German border defenses, the dreaded West Wall. Here, the tanks were not tools of exploitation, but targets. They were stymied by dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, craters, and a new, sudden stiffening of German resistance. The U.S. division was forced to dig in, fighting costly, limited battles for small patches of high ground near towns like Bussbach, combining small forces of tanks with attached infantry. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. At the center of this new, grinding war was the M4 Sherman tank. The M4 was America's main battle tank, the workhorse of the Allied armies. More than 49,000 of them were built during the war, a staggering feat of industrial production that made it one of the most produced tanks in history. But the Sherman had problems, serious, fatal problems. Its 75mm M3 gun, while an excellent infantry support weapon, struggled to penetrate the thick, sloped frontal armor of the new generation of German tanks. Its own armor was thin, especially when compared to the German Panther and Tiger. The Sherman's front hull, or glacis plate, was a respectable 2 inches, or 5.1 centimeters, thick. Its primary protection came not from its thickness, but its steep slope, often set at 56 degrees, which dramatically increased its effective thickness and helped deflect projectiles. But its sides were another story. The side hull was a flat, vertical 1.5 inches, or 3.8 centimeters. Its rear hull armor was exactly the same, a mere 1.5 inches. In a direct head-to-head fight, the Shermans were often outgunned and hopelessly outmatched. The German Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun, or the Tiger's legendary 88, could punch through the Sherman's frontal armor from distances where the Sherman's own gun was useless. Soldiers had a dark joke for it. They called the Sherman a Ronson, after the popular cigarette lighter, because it lit up the first time every time. Still, the Sherman had advantages. It was fast. It was mechanically reliable and easy to repair. And it had a phenomenal turret. The Sherman's turret could be rotated 360 degrees, using either a hydraulic system or a manual crank. Its traverse rate was a blistering 24 degrees per second, meaning it could complete a full rotation in about 17 seconds. A German Panther or Tiger, by contrast, could take nearly a minute to do the same. The Sherman also had superior sighting systems. When used smartly, especially in coordinated groups where they could use their speed and numbers to overwhelm the enemy, they could win. But that was the key. They required tactics. They required a new way of thinking. And they required soldiers willing to think differently. That's where Harlon Vickery came in. After 2 months of brutal skirmishes and terrifying close calls, his tank crew had developed the fatalistic bond that only combat can forge. His commander was Staff Sergeant Gene Corbin, a loud-talking Chicago native who didn't much care for theory or nuance. "Keep it simple," Corbin used to say. "Drive, shoot, survive." But Harlon, the quiet mechanic, was starting to think survival wasn't going to come from driving and shooting, at least not in the way Corbin meant. It was going to come from a surprise. It was going to come from thinking like the enemy, from doing something no one else dared to do. This entire theater of war was a testament to doctrinal failure. The restrictive terrain, the dense woods, the copious minefields, and the intense, accurate German fire severely limited the traditional advantages of American armored units. Armor employment was largely dictated by the supporting role to infantry, often occurring in small, isolated units where maneuver was minimal or impossible. One night, while cleaning the breech of the 75mm gun after a long, cold day's patrol, Harlon finally brought it up. "What if," he asked, his voice low, "what if we set up the Sherman in reverse?" The loader, Rizzo, laughed, the sound sharp in the cold. "You mean shoot backwards?" "No," Harlon said, his voice patient, as if explaining a faulty carburetor. "I mean park it facing away from the road. Rotate the turret 180 degrees. Use the rear to face the enemy. That way we can back into a position, fire, and pull forward to retreat. We lower our profile, we stay hidden in a defilade, and we can strike first. Corbin stared at him for a long, heavy moment, then shook his head. "That's the dumbest damn thing I've heard all day," he said. But Harlon wasn't joking. He was already planning, already doing the math, already figuring out how to make it work. At first, no one took Harlon seriously. The idea of deliberately pointing their weakest armor toward the enemy was insane. The idea of using a Sherman tank, a brawler, like a sniper rifle was laughable to most of the crew. They called it hillbilly logic. They said he was trying to fight tanks the way a squirrel hunts deer, sitting still and waiting for something too big to miss. Sergeant Corbin, the tank commander, made it clear. "This isn't the kind of war where you get to sit back and aim pretty," he barked. "You see a panther, you shoot fast, or you're dead faster." But Harlon didn't back down. He kept thinking. He kept drawing sketches in a small, battered notebook. He kept running the math. Elevation angles, shell drop over distance, estimated armor thickness at oblique angles. He studied the capabilities of his 75mm M3 gun. He paid special attention to the high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, the HVAP. These rounds were his best hope. They could, in theory, penetrate up to 120 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. But their effectiveness dropped sharply with distance. If he was going to snipe, he had to be close. He had to be hidden. And he had to choose his angles perfectly. He wasn't just proposing a tactic. He was proposing a solution to a complex engineering problem. To turn the turret 180 degrees was, in itself, a challenge. While the M4's hydraulic traverse was fast, the physical space was the issue. The 75mm M3 gun was relatively short. It had 0 inches of forward overhang. This meant that when the turret was rotated to the rear, the muzzle of the gun would be positioned immediately over the rear hull and the engine deck. This was the single greatest limitation. Shermans in combat were often described as looking like gypsy wagons or rolling spare shops. Their rear decks were festooned with a massive array of external gear. Blanket rolls, rations, spare track links, and aerial recognition panels, all tied down. This stowage would directly obstruct the main gun barrel's movement, and it would make achieving any significant gun depression, the standard -10 to -12 degrees, functionally impossible. Harlon's tactic wouldn't just require a new way of thinking, it would require a new way of packing. The crew would have to keep that rear deck clear. There were other issues. The .50 caliber machine gun, often mounted on the turret hatch, could interfere with crew movement. And visibility was a paradox. For the turret crew, Harlon the gunner and Rizzo the loader, it would actually be better. They would be positioned facing the direction of fire and observation. But for the driver, still in the front hull, it would be a nightmare. To pull forward to retreat, the driver would be moving the tank in reverse, blind, relying entirely on Sergeant Corbin's shouted directions. The one advantage Harlon had, which he may have calculated, was his weapon. The 75mm M3 gun was designed without a muzzle brake because it didn't need one. This meant the blast was clean, making it easier for him to follow the shot. The larger, high-velocity 75mm guns used on later Shermans did have a big muzzle blast, one that kicked up dust and left lingering smoke that obscured the crew's view. For his specific purpose, his inferior gun was, in fact, the perfect tool. He looked for cover, for high ground, for tree lines. He scouted for clearings where German tanks might cross in single file, unaware of a Sherman hidden in the woods, its turret pointed like a coiled snake. Still, no one approved his setup. Not until one afternoon in mid-November. The forest was soaked from days of freezing rain. Mud clung to boots like quicksand. The unit had been shelled every morning for a week. The men were exhausted, cold, and constantly on edge. That day, a nearby tank crew had been ambushed while turning a corner near the village of Wassenach. One Sherman took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust, the cheap, man-portable, and lethal anti-tank weapon that German infantry carried. A guy in a foxhole with a Panzerfaust, the tankers would say, could knock out a tank. This one had. It blew the turret clean off. There was nothing left to bury. That night, Harlon made his move. He asked Rizzo, the loader, to help him run a private test. They snuck out early the next morning during a routine patrol assignment. Instead of taking the usual forward observation position, Harlon had them pull back into a dense patch of trees overlooking a small muddy field, the kind the Germans often used to reposition their armor. He had the driver reverse the tank into the brush. He rotated the turret 180 degrees, adjusted the elevation, and waited. Nothing happened for hours. Just the wind, the freezing rain, and the occasional distant crack of small arms fire. Rizzo was shivering, miserable. But then, through the fog, movement. Not tanks, just a pair of German motorcycle scouts. Still, Harlon tracked them through the gun sight. He followed their lazy, arrogant arc across the clearing. He didn't fire. It wasn't worth revealing the position. But something clicked in his mind. The shot was there. He could have taken it. They returned to camp without incident. Corbin scolded him for deviating from patrol orders, but Harlon didn't argue. He just nodded. He knew what he had seen. He knew it could work. The next day, everything changed. A single German tank, most likely a lone Panther, was spotted near the ridge just west of the town of Schmidt. It had been harassing supply lines for days, firing from a long distance and disappearing before American units could respond. Artillery couldn't pin it down. Air support, blinded by the fog and the dense forest canopy, wasn't available. The German tank sat on the high ground of the Schmidt-Kommarscheid spur, where it had excellent observation over the American positions. So Corbin, half joking, his voice edged with desperation, turned to Harlon. "You still think that squirrel tactic of yours works?" Harlon nodded. "Then get up there and prove it." They gave him one shot, one chance. Harlon chose his position with the care of a master surveyor. He picked a spot near a clearing off the Cal Trail, the muddy, narrow road used by both American infantry and armor to reach Schmidt. This trail was a death trap. It was a tortuous, twisted cart track, barely the width of a tank. It dropped precipitously into the deep, wooded gorge of the Cal River. The soft ground and sharp rock abutments caused tanks to constantly throw their tracks or belly up on ridges, blocking the path for everyone behind them. It was a place where tanks went to die. Harlon reversed the Sherman into the brush. C-113 disappearing into the landscape. Turret facing out, 180 degrees. Engine off. Silence. He waited. The fog rolled in, thick and heavy. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. And then it happened. A Panther rolled into view. Just the tip of its turret, slicing through the fog like a shark's fin. Harlon didn't wait for it to clear fully. He had already done the math. He adjusted, took a breath, and fired. The 75mm round screamed through the trees and struck true. The explosion lit up the fog like lightning. Flames licked upward. A German crewman scrambled out, trailing smoke. Then another. Then silence. The kill was confirmed. Long range. First shot. Turret backwards. No one laughed anymore. That one shot didn't just take out a tank. It rewrote what a Sherman could be. And for Harlon Vickery, it was only the beginning. The Hürtgen Forest wasn't just a battlefield. It was a 50-square-mile meat grinder. It was where American dreams of a quick victory, born from the breakout in Normandy, went to die in the frozen mud. Fog, mines, booby traps, and artillery so constant it became part of the air. More than 33,000 American casualties would be recorded in that forest, a number that eclipsed the losses at the Battle of the Bulge. And in November of 1944, Harlon Vickery and his crew were thrown right into the worst of it. Orders came down: hold the Cal Trail and push toward the town of Schmidt. The trail was a narrow, muddy scar winding through ravines and hills. The enemy had the high ground, the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge, which provided them with perfect observation. The trees were wired with booby traps. German 88mm guns, the most feared anti-tank weapon of the war, were zeroed in on the trail's every bend. These 88s were particularly hard to locate, as German crews had dug them into 12 by 12 by 6-foot holes, exposing only the barrel. They used bait tactics, with one gun firing to draw an American column into a prepared killing zone. And somewhere out there, the remaining Panthers and Jagdpanzers waited like wolves in the fog. It was hell on earth. Every corner, Harlon would later write in a letter home, felt like a death sentence. You didn't know if the next step would be mud or a mine. Their Sherman, C-113, was battered but operational. Corbin was tense, always checking maps. Rizzo, the loader, had stopped cracking jokes. And Harlon, he grew silent, focused. He wasn't afraid. He was preparing, because this time he had a plan. The success of his first backward shot wasn't luck. He had proven that. He had studied the terrain, calculated the shot, and chosen his angle with intent. Now he wanted to push the tactic further, not just one ambush, but a full-blown sniper setup. This was a non-standard tactic, but it was born from a deep tactical understanding of the principles of a reverse slope defense, or RSD. RSD was a recognized military tactic, though explicit documentation of its use by M4 units was limited. The concept was simple. A defending force positions itself on the slope of a hill opposite the attacking force. This masks their position from enemy observation and, crucially, reduces the effectiveness of the enemy's long-range direct fire. For the M4 Sherman, which was so vulnerable to the superior standoff range of the Panther and Tiger, this was critical for survival. A key advantage of RSD is that it forces the enemy to come within the defender's effective range before they can fire. It forces them to crest the ridge, where they are silhouetted against the sky, and often expose their thin, vulnerable belly armor. This defensive tactic was used effectively by American infantry and tanks in North Africa in 1943. But Harlon was doing something different. He was using the defensive principles of RSD for an offensive purpose. His idea was to find a bottleneck, a spot where German tanks would have to slow down, turn, or expose their flanks. He found it near the ridge above the WWII Creek. The terrain there dipped sharply, creating a natural funnel. To pass through, enemy armor would have to turn and cross exposed ground. Harlon proposed setting up in a camouflaged position near the tree line, turret reversed. He would have the driver position the hull angled so that if they were spotted, the vulnerable 1.5-inch rear armor would be at an oblique angle, increasing its effective thickness. It wasn't standard doctrine, but it wasn't mutiny either. Corbin hesitated. "This is a Sherman, Vickery, not a damn rifle on treads." "I know," Harlon replied, his voice flat. "But if we try to fight them head-on, they'll slice us in half. This terrain forces them to give us their side." After hours of tense discussion, Corbin relented. "One chance. You miss, we're running." They moved into position before dawn. The forest was dead silent. The only sound was the distant drip of water and the occasional snap of a frozen branch. They parked C-113 in a camouflaged dip behind a pile of fallen trees. Vickery aligned the 75mm gun toward the clearing, calculating the angle for when the enemy crested the hill and exposed their weaker side plates. And then they waited. Hours passed. The fog thickened. Then movement. It began as a low rumble, deep and mechanical. Then the crunch of treads on frozen earth. One tank, then two, then three. Panthers. Exactly as he had predicted. They emerged from the tree line like predators. Sleek, dark, deadly. The lead tank paused to scan the area, its long gun and heavy turret rotating slowly, arrogantly. Just a few more feet and it would expose its side plate. The Panther's side armor was only 40mm thick, a target Harlon knew his 75 could penetrate. Harlon didn't breathe. He didn't speak. He adjusted his sights with the precision of a surgeon. "Target locked," he whispered. He fired. The Sherman rocked back with the recoil. The shell sliced through the fog and struck the Panther's side. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. A deafening clang, followed by an eruption of flame. The turret blew upward. The tank staggered, and black smoke shot skyward. A confirmed kill. The other two Panthers slammed their turrets to the left, searching desperately for the source of the shot, but Harlon was already moving. "Reload!" he shouted. He had Rizzo reload, adjusted the sights, and fired again. The second shot struck the ground near the second tank, sending up a geyser of dirt and smoke. The third Panther, now panicked, opened fire, but it was firing blind, guessing. It was too late. "Go!" Harlon yelled. Corbin floored the engine, pulling the Sherman forward, out of its hidden nook and behind a tree-covered embankment. The whole engagement had taken less than 30 seconds. 2 hits, 1 confirmed kill, and the Panthers were now firing blindly into the fog. It was chaos. Corbin, his voice shaking with adrenaline, radioed in. "Enemy armor engaged. 1 confirmed destroyed. Vickery's sniper setup is working. I repeat, working." The reply from headquarters was disbelief. But it didn't matter. The remaining German tanks were retreating. The shot that rang out through the fog didn't just destroy a Panther. It shattered the myth that Shermans couldn't win unless they swarmed. Because one man, using a tactic no manual had ever taught, had just outgunned 3 enemies. And the forest, soaked in death and silence, was now witness to something it had never seen before. A Sherman sniper. From theory to legend. Word of the shot spread faster than the fog could settle. Within hours, other tank crews were talking about it over cold rations and smokes. "Did you hear about Vickery?" one gunner whispered. "Took out a Panther from cover, backwards." Most didn't believe it. Some said it was dumb luck. Others said it was a fluke. But by the next morning, the kill had been confirmed by a reconnaissance patrol. They found the burnt-out wreck, turret blown clean off, a clean entry point right through the side armor. There was no denying it now. Harlon Vickery had done what few in the European theater had accomplished. He had taken down a Panther with a 76mm Sherman from long range with a single shot, and he had done it without ever being seen. Sergeant Corbin, who had once called it the dumbest idea he'd ever heard, now began calling it Vickery's Vantage. When headquarters requested an after-action report, Corbin didn't sugarcoat it. Private Vickery's positioning and firing technique are unorthodox, he wrote, but effective. Permission requested to allow further testing of the reverse turret sniper tactic. No official reply came, no official approval. But, more importantly, no one told them to stop. So Harlon did it again. 2 days later, at another forest clearing near the town of Kammerscheid, he set up his Sherman. This time, he chose a narrow track just south of the road where German tanks were likely to push through in an attempt to flank the American line. He waited. Turret turned, engine off. Just before dusk, a column of German armor moved into view. A Panzer IV, followed by 2 half-tracks. Harlon fired. The Panzer exploded in a fireball that lit the entire tree line. The half-tracks scattered. Infantry scrambled into the woods. And for the second time in as many days, Harlon's Sherman escaped without a scratch. By now, his crew was fully bought in. Rizzo started calling the tank the Kentucky Rifle. Corbin joked about painting a squirrel mascot on the side. Even support crews started asking about his settings, what elevation he used, how he calculated distance, and what type of ammunition worked best. And behind the scenes, other crews began trying to replicate it, unofficially, quietly. Because if there was one thing the Hürtgen Forest was proving, it was that traditional tactics didn't work here. You couldn't brute force your way through minefields, pre-sighted 88s, and booby-trapped trails. You had to be smarter, you had to adapt, and that's exactly what Harlon was doing. This kind of bottom-up innovation was happening in isolated pockets all across the front, born of sheer, bloody necessity. The terrain and the enemy's anti-tank lethality were shattering American doctrine. Near Kammerscheid, Lieutenant Fly of the 707th Tank Battalion found himself in a desperate duel. He had already destroyed 3 Panzer IVs when he spotted a Panther advancing through an orchard. Fly fired high-explosive HE ammunition. The rounds bounced harmlessly off the Panther's tough hide. But, incredibly, the inexperienced German crew was so frightened by the impacts that they bailed out of their tank. Fly immediately seized this crucial, bizarre opportunity. He realized his armor-piercing AP ammunition was stored outside the tank, in the sponson rack. He turned his turret, retrieved the AP shells, and reloaded, just as the German crew, realizing their mistake, re-entered their tank. The Panther fired, but missed. Fly's crew, now loaded for bear, returned fire. Their first AP round cut the barrel of the German gun. 3 subsequent rounds tore into the Panther's side, setting it afire and killing the crew. In another engagement at Rammich, in November 1944, a Sherman from the 745th Tank Battalion was sitting in the darkness, lit only by other burning American tanks. A German Mark V Panther drove past, completely unaware, passing within 8 yards of the hidden Sherman. The American gunner silently swung his fast turret and destroyed the Panther at point-blank range. These were the tactics of the desperate, using HE to bluff, waiting in the dark for an 8-yard shot, and Harlon's backward sniper setup. These weren't tactics from a manual. They were solutions invented by men who were seconds from death. But adaptation came at a cost. As Harlan's legend grew, so did the danger. The Germans were no fools. They started changing their patterns, avoiding the obvious tree lines, sending scouts ahead, and firing blindly into suspected ambush points. One Panther even attempted a counter-sniper maneuver, firing high-explosive rounds into suspected American tank positions before entering the area. Harlan and his crew narrowly avoided death when a shell landed just 20 feet from their position, showering them in dirt and shrapnel. It shook them, but it didn't stop them. Because now, they weren't just surviving, they were rewriting the playbook. And somewhere between Kammerscheit and Schmidt, amid frozen boots, jammed radios, and the ever-present stench of cordite, Harlon Vickery, farm kid, math brain, quiet thinker, was becoming something the war had never seen before. An armored sniper, a myth with a name, and a turret pointed in the wrong direction. November 26, 1944. It was the day the forest exploded. The Germans, desperate to hold the line before the Allies could reach the Ruhr River, launched a massive counteroffensive. They hammered the K-Trail and slammed into the villages of Kammerscheit and Schmidt. American infantry were being pulverized by artillery and pinned down by dug-in machine guns. Panther tanks advanced through the narrow, booby-trapped roads, supported by mortars and tree-bursting shells that rained down like shrapnel snow. Harlan's unit was ordered to hold the southern edge of Kammerscheit. No backup, no air support, just a handful of Shermans, some scattered riflemen, and enough ammunition to last, maybe, a day. The order was simple. If you lose this ridge, we lose the whole line. At dawn, the fog returned, thicker than ever. Harlan set up his Sherman, C-113, behind a low stone wall at the edge of the village. He faced the hull away from the main road. Again, the turret was reversed. Again, the crew felt the cold knot of fear. "Vickery," Corbin said quietly over the intercom, his voice tight. "If they hit us from here, we've got nowhere to run." "We're not going to run," Harlan replied, his eye to the sight. "We're going to hit first." They went quiet. Each man took his position. Rizzo checked the rounds, his hands moving with practiced speed. 2 HVAPs loaded first, then standard armor-piercing, then smoke. The ground began to shake. German Panthers rolled in, 3 of them supported by infantry. Their formation was tight, efficient. They had likely studied American movement and were expecting frontal resistance from a hull-down Sherman. They weren't expecting Harlan's backward turret aimed from their flank. The first tank crossed into view. Harlan adjusted for distance. 700 yards, he breathed. The fog shifted, just enough to give him a clean silhouette. He fired. The shells struck low, a perfect shot, hitting the drive sprocket. The Panther stopped cold, its mobility gone. Flames burst from underneath. The tank was out of the fight. But now the second tank, alerted by the blast, opened fire toward their position. Debris flew, trees shattered. The Sherman rocked as a shell detonated just behind them. "Reload!" Harlan shouted, his voice calm amid the chaos. Rizzo slammed the next HVAP round into the breach. Up! Harlan aimed again, this time for the turret ring of the second tank. He fired. The round punched through. The heavy German turret lifted a full 2 feet from the hull before fire consumed the crew compartment. The tank shuddered, then collapsed inward like a dying animal. 2 down. Then came the third. It saw them, its long gun turned. Slow, deliberate, deadly. The black hole of the muzzle locked on to their position. "Move!" Harlon screamed. Corbin gunned the engine, but the tracks just spun, caught in the deep, frozen mud that plagued the Cal Trail region. They were stuck. The turret of the 3rd Panther locked on. This was it. Then, just as the German tank was about to fire, boom! A shell from another Sherman, an American Sherman, struck the Panther from the opposite side. Reinforcements had arrived, drawn by the smoke and Corbin's frantic radio chatter. The 3rd Panther tried to pivot, but it was caught in a crossfire. It exploded in a column of smoke and steel. The battlefield went quiet, save for the crackle of burning tanks and the distant sound of small arms fire. 3 Panthers, all destroyed. And Harlon's Sherman, scratched, shaken, scorched, was still standing. They pulled back behind the ridge as medics moved in and the infantry pushed forward. Harlon sat in the silence of the turret, his hands trembling for the first time. "You all right?" Rizzo asked, his voice hoarse. Harlon nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" "That was the shot I was afraid of," Harlon said. "The one where you're already dead before you fire." But he had fired, and he had won. The first shot through the fog had been theory. This, the shot under fire, was proof. That day, officers began calling Harlon's tactics long gun doctrine. Some wanted to write it up, others didn't know what to make of it. But among the tank crews, the men who fought, froze, and bled in the forest, Harlon Vickery's name started to mean something. Not just skill, not just survival, but the courage to do the opposite of what fear demanded. In war, legends spread fast, but trust spread slower. After the battle at Kommerscheid, tank crews across the 3rd Armored Division started whispering about Vickery's method. A few tried it, most didn't. Not because they doubted the kill counts, those were real and confirmed, but because they feared the setup. It ran counter to everything they had been taught. Tank doctrine said, face forward, charge with strength, fire, maneuver, and stay mobile. What Harlon was doing, reversing into position, sitting still, turret turned backward, felt suicidal. Against German 88mm guns, one misstep, one miscalculation could turn a tank crew into ashes. But the numbers were creeping in. In 3 confirmed engagements using the backward setup, Harlon's crew had destroyed 5 German tanks, including 2 Panthers and a Panzer IV, without taking a single hit to the hull. Officers started asking questions, not just about Harlon, but about doctrine itself. Could Sherman tanks, long mocked as inferior, actually outperform expectations through smarter positioning? Could a single well-placed gunner, thinking more like a sniper than a tanker, shift the odds in these deadly forests? Harlon didn't care about the debate. He cared about the men inside his tank. He cared about staying alive. And most of all, he cared about not wasting shots. "You don't fire unless you're sure," he told a junior crew one night over cold stew. "Every shell costs more than metal. It costs time, noise, and your position. So you wait, you breathe, you think." That's what made Harlon different. Other gunners shot by instinct. Harlon shot by thought. But with fame came friction. One senior officer, Colonel Bennett, dismissed the tactic entirely in a briefing. "Turning your turret backwards is a great way to die looking the wrong way," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This war is about mobility, not hiding like a coward in the brush." When Harlon heard that, he didn't get angry. He just replied, his voice as quiet as ever. "With all due respect, sir, cowards don't sit still when panthers roll into view." The room went silent. Sergeant Corbin backed him. So did two other tank commanders who had seen the results firsthand. And slowly, piece by piece, the brass began to allow for situational flexibility in armor engagements. It was unofficial language, but it was the green light. It gave crews permission to copy what Harlon had created. By December, at least 4 other crews in the division had begun using modified versions of the backward sniper setup. 2 of them scored confirmed tank kills. One crew in the 77th Tank Battalion credited the tactic with saving their lives during an ambush west of Gay. They used a downed barn as cover, reversed their turret, waited, and nailed a Jagdpanzer as it crept past. Unofficially, they named their tank the Vickery Special. But for Harlon, it was never about recognition. He still cleaned his cannon barrel by hand every night. He still wrote in his battered notebook, tracking each shot, its angle, and its result. And every time they moved to a new position, he scouted the land like a chessboard, looking for fields of fire, blind spots, escape routes. He had become more than a gunner. He was a tactician. And in a war where lives were measured in inches and seconds, that made him dangerous. Not just to the enemy, but to old ideas. Because the boy from Kentucky was doing more than killing tanks. He was changing the way American armor thought. By now, Harlon Vickery was known across the battalion, not just as a good shot, but as something else entirely. A quiet force, a thinker in a world of noise. But behind every legend, there is a cost. December rolled in hard. Snow began to blanket the forest, covering the mud and the graves. The cold wasn't just physical anymore, it was spiritual. Morale dipped. The fighting dragged on. The mud froze into jagged ice. Frostbite claimed fingers, feet, and entire limbs. Even the German Panthers began to stall from engine failures in the sub-zero temperatures. C-113, Harlon's Sherman, was now covered in dents, soot, and the smoke stains of past battles. They never painted it clean again. The scars became part of it, like a warning or a promise. Harlon changed, too. He no longer flinched at the sound of incoming artillery. He barely blinked when shrapnel tore through the bark of a nearby tree. But what did shake him, what stayed with him, was the silence. The silence that came after a shot, the knowing, the moment between the kill and the next breath, when he would realize that another crew, men just like him, would never climb out of that burning metal box. He wrote to his mother, "I don't know how to feel anymore. Every shot I make saves us, but every shot I make also means someone else's son doesn't go home. Sometimes I can still see the hatch opening just before the fire catches." Rizzo stopped joking altogether. Corbin grew more protective, refusing to take unnecessary risks. And Harlon began carrying with him a photo of his younger sister, Laya, 8 years old, hair in braids, smiling in front of the same tractor he used to repair back in Kentucky. He taped it to the inside of the turret, just above the rangefinder. "Something to remind me what I'm shooting for," he said. Even with this emotional weight, he never stopped adapting. In one engagement near the town of Bergstein, a place where other American crews were having success, with one of the new 75mm armed Shermans destroying 2 Panthers in the open, Harlon adapted his tactic again. He used elevation for the first time. He parked his 75mm Sherman on a steep slope, firing downward at a Tiger tank approaching from a road below. The angle was perfect. The shot pierced the rear engine plate, one of the few vulnerable spots on the heavy tank. 1 shot, 1 kill. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity, because every round they fired had to count. By now, the brass had stopped questioning him. In fact, they had begun quietly assigning him to forward observation roles, not to scout terrain, but to set up kill zones for his sniper tactics. They even brought in a second crew to learn directly from him. But Harlon didn't see himself as a teacher. He still saw himself as lucky. He still saw himself as the farm kid from Kentucky, just trying not to get his friends killed. One night, after their 20th mission, Corbin asked him, "What happens when this war is over, Harlon?" Harlon looked down at his hands, calloused, burned in places from hot shell casings. "I guess I'll go home," he said. "Fix tractors again. Maybe teach my sister how to drive." And for a moment it was quiet in the tank. No shells, no radio, just the wind through the trees and the memory of a boy who rewrote the rules. Not to be a hero, but to bring himself and his brothers home. When the snow finally melted over the shattered branches of the Hürtgen Forest in 1945, it revealed more than shell craters and burnt-out tanks. It revealed the ghosts of a doctrine undone, a way of fighting torn apart not by firepower, but by thought. Among those ghosts was the legacy of one young man, Harlon Vickery. He didn't change the war with rank or command. He had no battalion under his name, no patented tactic, no battlefield named after him. But what he did have was something far rarer, a mind that refused to accept the way things had always been done. The official reports never used his name. They referenced innovative turret positioning, non-linear tank deployment, and asymmetric armor utilization. But the crews who came back alive, the men of the 77th Tank Battalion who named their tank the Vickery Special, they didn't care for language like that. They just said, "He showed us we could fight smarter." And yet, Harlon wasn't there to see it. After a third near miss, a shell that killed the entire crew of the Sherman parked beside his, he requested to be rotated out. Not because he was scared, but because he was tired. Because he had seen too many good men die just inches away. He had proven what he came to prove. So they let him go. When he stepped off the train back in Whitley County, Kentucky, in the spring of 1945, no one saluted, no one cheered. His little sister ran up and hugged him. His father handed him a wrench. His mother set another plate at the table. And that, Harlon always said, was the best kind of welcome. He never built a career out of what he did. He never wrote a book. He never called himself a sniper. But if you drove by the Vickery place in the 1960s, you might have seen an old war shell on the mantel, polished, empty, harmless. And if you'd asked about it, he'd smile and say, "That's the one that let me come home." It's easy in hindsight to glorify war through numbers. Tanks built, battles won, enemies defeated. But stories like Harlon Vickery's remind us that war is not about volume. It's about decisions, micro-decisions. Quiet, calculated risks made by men no one notices until it's too late to forget them. Harlon didn't win through firepower. He won through a refusal to accept the obvious. He looked at the Sherman, a tank derided as a death trap, and saw its hidden strengths, its fast turret, its reliable gun, and its good sights. He looked at the Panther, a tank praised as invincible, and saw its crippling weaknesses, its slow turret, its thin side armor. He didn't try to beat the Panther at its own game. He changed the game. He asked a question that nobody else had the courage or the foolishness to ask. What if I turn the turret around? And in that question lived the seed of everything that followed. Lives saved, minds changed, and a new way of thinking born not from a textbook, but from the gut of a scared young man in a steel box. Maybe that's the real legacy of soldiers like him. Not the number of kills, but the number of lives that didn't have to die. Because one man decided to look at the battlefield backwards.